the root of what we're seeing playing out on the streets is a strong public concern over the decline of the majority group. So we've seen the percentage of people in the population who are white British fall sharply over the last 30 years.
What do you think's going on? Can you just talk a bit about the left, the establishment's reaction to these recent riots and protests?
Yeah, so I think there's a very instructive comparison between the reaction to England's riots in 2011, which happened under a Conservative government or a Conservative-led coalition, and the reaction to the riots of 2024. Now, more than 10 years ago, the left responded to the riots in England by saying this was not just about criminality, this was about austerity, this was about public cuts, this was about economic deprivation, and this was about the legitimate grievances that were driving people into criminality and looting and disorder. The reaction to the riots that have just happened this year in 2024 on the left of British politics is, let's just say, very different. Now we're told that the riots and the protests are simply about far-right thuggery, simply about criminality, simply about disorder. There are no legitimate grievances here at all. There are no understandable concerns. Keir Starmer has fallen over himself in interviews to basically ignore the two words of mass immigration. He just can't bring himself to even have a discussion about that. So many people in the country see the hypocrisy. And for people on the left, I think what is so difficult during these particular disturbances and protests is, I think, their awareness that this is in fact the direct result of 30 years of policies that began under Tony Blair and New Labour, were then continued by the so-called Conservatives in the Conservative Party, were put on steroids by Boris Johnson, who liberalised the whole system and lost control of the borders, and are now going to reach even higher levels. Mass immigration is going to become even more profound under Keir Starmer and Labour, who have already announced a series of policy changes within a month or so of coming into power. We're going to have more migration from Afghanistan. The salary thresholds are going to be abolished. The Rwanda deal has gone. The Illegal Migration Act has been amended. We are going to see rates of inward migration over the next 5 years that are going to be even higher than the ones that we've seen until now. And they've done all of that while simultaneously expecting people in the majority group not to react at all, not to ask questions about, is this actually good for our economy? Well, lots of evidence suggests it isn't good for our economy. We are now addicted, like a drug addict, to low-wage, low-skill migration that drives consumption, but is not actually contributing in a net beneficiary sense to the economy. We know it's aggravating and worsening the housing crisis. We know it's driving up house prices. We know it's driving up rents. Yet we cannot link housing with the issue of immigration. We're not allowed to do that. So we end up in this rather bizarre conversation around planning reform without discussing what's actually fueling demand for housing in our country. And as your question alluded to, we're also essentially told that if we point to some of the very visible problems within multiculturalism, like the grooming scandal, we are basically racist for pointing to that. Now, I would ask Labour and the left a question. Why is it that the riots and protests were so visible in towns like Rotherham? Why is that? Well, anybody who's looked at Rotherham knows that is intimately connected to the fact that it is estimated 1,400 mainly young white working class girls were basically gang raped, sexually assaulted and abused by organised Pakistani Muslim gangs who basically demonstrated they have no interest at all in respecting the rule of law, in respecting our ways of life, in respecting things like mutual trust, respect, cooperation, all of the things that actually make a multi-ethnic national community possible and viable. And that is why the grooming scandal really matters here, because it cuts to the heart of this debate over multiculturalism. Now, you cannot subject children, adults and communities to those kinds of things and expect them not to react. It is irrational not to react. And so the reaction has found its expression, albeit, unfortunately and somewhat incoherently, through rioting and disorder. But behind it are these understandable concerns around migration and integration. And we see this, by the way, Stephen, this is not just my opinion, we see this in the polling. If you look at the YouGov polling that we've had, yes, most people absolutely reject violence and criminality. They reject racism, and I think that's a good thing in British society. We also see in that polling large numbers of voters, sometimes up to 60%, about 58%, saying actually these protests, when done peacefully, people think they have sympathy for them, they can understand the point behind them. And that's where I think Labour and the left are lost, because they're viewing this as far-right thuggery, they're viewing this as racism, they're ducking the much bigger debate that we need to have in this country, which is about how on earth are we going to come out of this experiment? And that's what it is. No country has ever gone through this before in history. This is an experiment with unprecedented mass immigration, much of it coming from countries that are outside of Europe, many of them are predominantly Islamic countries. Many of the people coming into Britain illegally are mainly young Muslim men, very few women and children on those boats. We don't know actually what's going to happen. No country has gone through something like this. We have a higher share of foreign-born people in Britain than America had at the time of Ellis Island, right? I mean, this is unprecedented, what Britain is going through. So how can we come out on the other side as a healthy, vibrant, integrated community? Nobody can really answer that question. We're just hoping that this works out while not really talking about it and not expecting the British people and the English people to say anything about it. And I don't personally think that's a sustainable situation. That's why I've been writing about it. That's why I've been challenging the elite consensus in this country about it and saying, look, we need to completely change course, right? And that's what I've been trying to do.
You talk about the left and you talk about Labour, but I also want to ask about the Conservative reaction to this. Look at Priti Patel. Priti Patel, she joined in the chorus against people like Nigel Farage. Rishi Sunak, what's he said in any way in opposition to Keir Starmer? How are the Conservatives holding Starmer to account for this? How are the Conservatives representing all of these people with legitimate concerns, millions of voters, who are absolutely furious around the betrayal over mass migration? So what about the Conservative Party's reaction to these protests?
I personally think the Conservative Party is philosophically, ideologically lost. I don't think the Conservative Party knows what it is anymore. I don't think the Conservative Party knows what it should be saying anymore. I don't think the Conservative Party knows who should be voting for it anymore. It has been completely adrift from the country since the Brexit referendum. It has been playing the same identity politics games as Labour and the left. We've seen even leadership contenders like Kemi Badenoch using the same rhetoric as left-wing identitarians. We've seen Priti Patel making comments that I don't think are useful for a Conservative to be making. I mean, it is ironic that Priti Patel is seen as a potential leadership, a potential leader for the Conservative Party, having herself presided over the mass liberalisation of the immigration system. And look, at the end of the day, we would not have Nigel Farage in British politics. We would not have the Reform Party in British politics. We would not have Tommy Robinson with millions of followers. We would not have GB News. We would not have people like me writing about this stuff on Substack, were it not for the failures of the political establishment on issues around mass migration. If the political establishment had basically delivered what they said they would deliver, which was lower overall numbers, a self-governing independent nation with control over its borders, you and I would not be having this discussion. What happened, as we know, left and right presided over a consensus that suited the elite, but basically sold everybody else down the river. They built an economy that was completely organized around cheap migrant labor that global corporations loved, the London Liberals loved because it fueled their sense of moral righteousness. It brought them very few costs. They didn't have to pay the costs of mass immigration. But this policy has imposed enormous costs on everybody else. It's suppressed wages. It's directly worsened the housing crisis. It's undermined social cohesion. It's reduced social trust. If you look at the research, it's pretty clear. Robert Putnam said this about 20 years ago. Highly diverse nations tend to be low trust nations, where people become less supportive of contributing to the welfare state. Now, why is that? Because they don't know who's living next to them. They don't know who's in their community. So why would they trust their fellow citizens? And this essentially is what's happening to Britain. We are entering a sort of low trust, declining, divided society with high rates of segregation, and where if you do express a voice, you do express concern, you are wrapped up with the very sort of fringe minority of far-right loons and branded as far-right. And what's happened over the last 20 years, and look, I used to work in the academic literature on this, so like I'm very aware of what's happened. The term far-right, which most academics used to say was meaningless, by the way, because it's so broad, it encompasses so many things, it's been inflated to include people who aren't far right at all, but are asking questions like, is mass immigration sustainable? Or saying, actually, it's not sustainable at all. Is integration working? Why is it that we have Sharia courts operating in the UK? Is Islam compatible with Western liberal society? Why are second and third generation British Muslims going on the tube and blowing up their fellow citizens, or subjecting young white girls to organised industrial scale rape? Why is this happening? The far right has been expanded, inflated as a term to encompass a lot of those people. And I think that's fueling a lot of this division in British society. That's why Nigel Farage is doing better than ever, I think, because people are looking for a voice within that conversation, a voice that they don't have when they look at the established political parties. So I think those parties now have an option, right? They can either respond now to the grievances, and that includes the Conservative Party, stop being a liberal party, start being a Conservative Party, get back to actually what a Conservative Party is about. You have to protect the nation. You have to protect our home. And if you are not willing to do that, if you're not willing to do things like leave the European Convention on Human Rights, reform the Human Rights Act, commit to, I would argue, a freeze on all non-essential migration outside of the NHS, if you're not willing to do all of those things, then maybe you should join the Labour Party or the Liberal Democrats. The blunt reality is most people in this country don't feel safe, and they're looking for a Conservative Party or a Conservative movement to conserve the things they care about, to conserve their national identity, their culture, their history, their traditions, their ways of life. And if the Conservative Party doesn't deliver that, well, I'm pretty sure the Reform Party will give it a pretty good go at delivering that instead. And that's where we are, right? This is ultimately about people feeling like they don't have a voice in this system.
How has immigration changed the ethnic makeup of Britain?
Well, it's changed it in profound ways. And I think at the root of what we're seeing playing out on the streets is a strong public concern over the decline of the majority group. So we've seen the percentage of people in the population who are white British fall sharply over the last 30 years. In many areas, we've seen white British, especially in schools, by the way, which reflects the wider trends taking place, become a minority, and that is fueling intense concerns over what the decline of the majority group means for the future of the country. Now, this is where I depart from the left, because people on the left will say fears over the decline of the majority ethnic group are racist. What I would say is a concern about the loss of the familiar is not the same as a dislike of the perceived outsider. And many people feel that they're losing the familiar because of the decline of the majority ethnic group. So, as I said earlier on, the percentage of people born outside of the UK who are now in the UK is around 17, 18%. That's much higher than it was in the US at the time of the really big migration wave, and it's also higher than what it is in the US today. And if you look at the future trends, this will only accelerate, depending on what forecast you look at. You know, white Brits will become a minority somewhere around the year 2070, maybe depending, some forecasts suggest it's a little earlier. Over the next 12 years between now and the year 2036, which really isn't that long, long from now, even the government's own forecast suggests that we're going to have about 6.5 million more people coming into Britain, 6.1 million of those because of immigration. So immigration is going to be responsible for 90% of all of our population growth over the next decade or so. So we're going to expand by a city about 75% the size of London over the next 12 years. Nobody yet is explaining how we're going to manage that change. And as the birth rate continues to decline in the UK, it's projected to fall to about 1.3 by the year 2100. Now, the replacement level, where a population is naturally replacing itself, is 2.1. So we're already below that. We're about 1.6. I think we're going to go down to about 1.3. So we have an enormous decision to make as a society. You can either now pivot to having a pro-family government policy and national culture which encourages people to have more children, which encourages that natural change, or you can continue to keep your foot on the pedal of unprecedented rates of mass immigration, creating a society that is going to be more divided and low trust. At the moment, it is immigration that is fueling the biggest increase in our population since the late 1940s. And of course, much of that is coming from outside of Europe. It's coming from Pakistan, Nigeria, Afghanistan, countries that are, I would argue, culturally very different, and some might argue incompatible in many ways with England, with Britain, with our ways of life and culture. So the changes are absolutely unprecedented, and they're fueling concerns over the decline of the majority group. And Stephen, I would just add that those concerns are shared by minority groups too. I mean, Eric Kaufman, who's an academic, a good friend of mine, he's done lots of work on this, showing that it isn't only the majority who fear the decline of their group in society, but minorities also fear the decline of that majority group because they associate the national community with the myths and the traditions and the symbols of that majority group. What does it mean were Britain and England to be majority minority? What would be holding us together? What would be integrating us? What would be giving us a sense of purpose and unity? It's not only members of the majority community who feel concerned about that, it's also minorities too. So the changes have been profound. They're not just to do with racism, and they're most likely going to accelerate in the years ahead.
Do ethnically English people exist?
Yes, of course they exist. So I was asked this question recently on a debate with Ash Sarkar, the self-described libertarian communist who works for Novara Media, and Ash asked a perfectly reasonable question to me, which I think she anticipated was a sort of gotcha moment, where she said, "Look, am I English?" And my response to Ash Sarkar was, "Well, you're certainly British and English in terms of nationality, but not in terms of ethnicity. We know that Englishness has a very long tradition, is rooted, has ancestral origins that can be traced back hundreds, if not thousands of years. We know, this is a reason why in America and Canada the census gives the options of English. So many Americans recently who might be watching this interview were shocked to discover when they were doing DNA testing that the results were coming back saying that they were ethnically English. But yeah, we do, of course, we have ethnic origins. Now, I think for people on the left, that quickly becomes a discussion about racism because they only tend to think of nationalism in terms of a very thin, multicultural, civic vision of nationalism, and then everything else is what they would consider to be, blood and soil, ethnic nationalism. And so they frame the debate as being about, are you in the community or are you outside of the community? But as I said, most people out there hold a much more nuanced view of who we are, including the English, where they say actually, for a large number of people, that ancestry is very important, as is the shared traditions, the culture, the values, the language, respecting the rule of law. And it's, as the British Social Attitude Survey has shown, it's a bit of a mixed bag for a lot of people. They're not saying you have to be white to be English or British, but they are saying actually, on balance, we think that if you're in this national community, you should respect. Ideally, you should have some linkage to that community. You should certainly respect the traditions and the culture and the values of that community. You should be concerned about the decline of that community, because ultimately this comes down to the deeper question of what is it that makes us and us. Now, the kind of elite class would say it's about the celebration of diversity. It's about the celebration of multiculturalism. I would push back on that and say, well, if the only thing that makes us and us is that we celebrate welcoming others, then it's like saying you don't really have an identity of your own. If the only thing that is defining our national identity is that we celebrate diversity, well then who are we? It's a sort of accepting that we don't really have a distinctive core. Now, many people in England and Britain would reject that. They would say, no, we do have something that is distinctive and unique, and exclusive to us. I think that's ultimately what this debate takes us into. And it is why I think so many people have been rebelling politically and also socially, and unfortunately in some cases physically in recent years, because they can't quite articulate that. They have a sense that there is something being lost, and they have a sense that they need to express their voice in order to reassert that identity against an elite class that doesn't quite get it, against the winds of immigration and globalization, which are undermining and diluting that identity, and against this broken model of multiculturalism that says, well, actually, if you do celebrate your distinctive identity, then you're somehow problematic for doing so. There's something wrong with you. And I think many people out there in the country would certainly push back against that very strongly.
When it comes to countries like Ukraine being invaded by Russia, or historically other nations being colonized by invaders, the left are very vocal about these nations being destroyed, about these national identities being wiped out. Why don't they apply those same moral standards to when Britain is being colonized in some ways? And that's what they describe it. That's the language that they use. They call it reverse colonization. They say that this is essentially, immigration is a punishment for our empire. We went out and invaded the world, and therefore we must let the world invade us. So why don't the left apply these same moral standards to England and to Britain as they apply to nations who are ethnic minority, or countries like Ukraine?
Well, I think it's a great question. The simple answer is because they hate who we are. If you look at the work of some of my colleagues in recent years, what they have shown is essentially what's happened to the elite class is that they've embraced this idea that racial, sexual, and gender minorities are sacred, are morally superior, and members of the majority group are to be treated with suspicion, if not contempt, because they are dangerous, they're far-right thugs, they're extremists, and increasingly the elite class derive their sense of status, their sense of belonging, in many ways their identity, by denigrating the majority group, its identity, history, and culture. Now, I'm certainly not the first person to point this out. Roger Scruton, a conservative philosopher, famously talked about the culture of repudiation, or oikophobia. He talked about the way in which the elite class in England and Britain, and he was writing in the 1990s, before the experiment with mass immigration really took off. And Scruton made the point that the elite class has now become fully invested in this culture of repudiation, repudiating the country from where they belong, because they'd rather derive their legitimacy and status from other elites, from supranational organizations like the European Union, for example, which is why the elite class struggled so much with things like Brexit. But before Roger Scruton, there were people like Daniel Bell in the 1970s who talked about the rise of an adversary class, and he talked about an elite, mainly in America, that was unlike the traditional elite, the old elite, we might say, derived its sense of esteem and achievement by basically exhibiting a sort of dislike of majority culture, and it would sort of mock and laugh and denigrate majority culture in order to win more kudos from other members of the elite. And that's why I think, partly as well, this is ideological. We have seen the rise of things like critical race theory. We've seen the rise of social justice ideas and movements on the university campuses, which have spread out into other elite institutions. And that has compounded a lot of this. But, most of the people who are writing about what's happening in the West today in terms of the rise of wokeism, a kind of anti-British, anti-Western outlook, trace this really back to the beginning of the 20th century and say that the elite class over time has basically diverged from the country that lives around themselves and have basically poured scorn on the majority culture and identity as a way of trying to win more status and kudos for themselves from other elites. And that is why people are rebelling, I think, so much today. I think they look at the national conversation and they see this tendency to treat the majority group as a source of embarrassment, as a source of shame. The way in which members of the elite class talk about, for example, the English, they cannot get over the idea that actually there might be people in England who are not part of a football hooligan firm or who are not a kind of far-right thug and so forth. And they struggle to accept that many of the concerns that are driving ordinary people are entirely understandable, entirely legitimate about the decline of the majority group. So, the elite class has basically gone off a cliff. It's moved sharply leftwards. It's embraced these ideologies, and it's become very disconnected, I would argue, from the viewpoint of the average voter. And I expect this will only accelerate. If I were to rub my crystal ball and say what's going to happen now, I'd think in Britain and England, also partly in the US if Trump wins in November, I think we will see the continuing radicalization of the elite class. Andrew Sullivan, a US writer, has made this point, and I think he's right. We are currently living through the greatest radicalization of the elite class since the 1960s. That they are now rebelling against the likes of Trump and Brexit, the rise of populism, these grassroots rebellions among voters, by doubling down on their own elite beliefs and values. And so they're moving further and further away from the average voter on many of these cultural identity questions.
Would England be a better place without immigration, without the Empire Windrush landing in the 1940s? Would England be a better place?
I think England would certainly be a better place without mass immigration. I personally think we need some migration, but I think we need to have limited migration. I think we need some migration for the National Health Service, and to some extent the social care system, but I do not think we need anything like what we currently have in terms of net migration rates of 700,000 a year. I think this is, as I say, mass immigration is managed decline. Let me put it like this. I was in Sweden recently, and Sweden used to be held up as the case study for how immigration works. Sweden was notoriously liberal. It was very tolerant. The Swedes basically redefined their national identity around pro-immigration, essentially. I was there a couple of weeks ago. I could not find a serious senior person on the left or right of Swedish politics who said immigration, mass immigration, worked out for Sweden. What I heard instead was a cross-party consensus that mass migration has been a disaster for Swedish society. It has it's produced and driven gang violence. It has left the Swedes feeling scared and anxious in their own country, and it has given them a very depressing sense that things are going to get worse, that the present is already worse than the past, but the future is going to be even more bleak. And you can see that, by the way, in the data. Sweden, by the year 2050, if you look at the Pew Research Centre will be about 31% Muslim by 2050 because of decisions Sweden has made. Now, if Sweden is reaching that conclusion and France is reaching that conclusion, it tells you a lot actually about the impact of mass migration. And I think this is a real test now for Britain and England to say, look, unless we hit pause, and I mean freeze all non-essential migration for a long period of time, I think we are going to have some very serious problems in our country, like Sweden, France, Germany, and Italy. Those problems we can already see. Well, we've begun to see them over the last 20 years, and they will become more acute. I'm happy to be a dissenting voice in sort of saying over and over again, this is going to be a very big mistake. We need to hit pause. We need to completely overturn multiculturalism. We need a much more assimilationist model of integration, which essentially says we're not going to tolerate people who don't tolerate our way of life anymore, and establish a boundary around that and a framework that delivers on that in a much more serious way.
My question wasn't really around recent mass migration, I suppose. It was more, if you look before the Second World War, Britain was a homogenous society. It was 99.9% white British, people who'd been here for generations. They were the English, the British people. After the Second World War, our political class made a decision to start importing people in small numbers to begin with from around the Commonwealth, ex-Commonwealth countries, ex-Empire countries, and then to ramp that up to the extent that we've seen now. My question is, would England be a better place if the political class didn't make that decision to open our borders and to essentially destroy the homogenous society that existed before the Second World War?
I think it's personally, I think it's a very difficult discussion to have, for the reason being that many of those people were British nationals, right? It was a different time, and we did have still a large empire, and it's not as easy to say, in hindsight, well, you should have made different policy choices. They were part of our community as it was defined at that particular point in time. So and as I say, I think more or less up until the 70s and the 80s, I think on balance, those change. I personally don't have a problem with those changes in British post-war society. I think what happened as you went through particularly the Thatcher years and came into the 90s, you then started to see the rise of a political class that really wasn't interested in moderate cultural demographic change anymore. It was much more interested in a very unrealistic and unprecedented pace of change, which obviously culminated with Tony Blair and what happened after 2004, and which was then basically the rise of a new cultural consensus in the country embraced by the Conservatives. But I think, at that particular point in time, we also had an enormous obligation, I think, to a lot of people, many of whom had served in the Second World War as well. So I'm less negative on the earlier waves of migration.
I suppose the reason I asked the question is because when one looks to a country like Japan, where they didn't make the decision to open their borders to every country in the world, they seem to have a very safe, functioning society. Same can be said of Hungary, Poland, and other places. I want to ask about
just on that briefly, if I can. Yeah. I was in Hungary recently, and the one thing I would say about Hungary is, if you ever want the transition or a contrast of going from a society where there was very little immigration in Hungary, there is a strong focus on preserving the borders, the integrity of the borders in Hungary. There's also a very vocal opposition to social liberalism, gender ideology. I saw very little homelessness. There was a little bit, but not much. I didn't see much in the way of drugs. It just seemed like a much more cohesive society. And then arriving in the UK, flying into London Luton, as riots and unrest were unfolding across the country, as we just discovered that Labour were further liberalising the immigration system, and as our political leaders were demonising much of the rest of the country as far-right thugs, even I found myself in a curious position of, hearing from Hungarians saying, what on earth is happening to your country? And I do think there's a just a brief, and I was in Washington recently as well, where I think you are. Um, what I don't think the British political class have fully understood, which is where Elon Musk comes into our conversation, is the extent to which political elites in other advanced democracies around the world think we have made some disastrous political choices. And they might not say it openly, but if you talk to senior, or some of them will, but if you talk to senior Republicans in the US, if you talk to Hungarians, if you talk to French political elites, if you talk to Swedish political elites, they will say you have either made an enormous mistake or you are about to feel the full effects of the same things that we went through recently. And I don't quite think Westminster has cottoned on to the wider perception of the UK. Look how many millionaires are leaving the UK as an example. Look how many affluent people are leaving the UK. The sense of long-term social cultural malaise has been picked up, I think, elsewhere around the world, especially America. And I don't think Westminster is really fully aware of that.
You talk about how communities have changed in Britain. One of those places that have completely transformed is the East End of London. Used to be white working class, Cockney people. That's where my family are originally from, Dockers, Salt of the Earth. Very sort of particular, strong community has a huge history and culture. And that's essentially been wiped out by immigration. If you go to somewhere like Tower Hamlets or Hackney or anywhere in East London, Stratford, these communities have totally changed. I mean, you'll walk around Whitechapel and you'll just see Arabic signs, or you'll see, lots of other languages. You'll see lots and lots of mosques. You'll see people wearing kind of Muslim garb and so on. And people from the East End, they've just moved to other parts of the country. They've moved. We went and filmed in Great Yarmouth, and we spoke with an old lady who said, she was from the East End, she had to move, and she feels that her country has completely changed for the worse.
Yeah, so I think there's a reason why people like Nigel Farage were doing so well in places like Clacton, places like Essex and Kent, because those are often the areas where EastEnders move to. I mean, I was in Clacton during the recent general election, where Nigel Farage is now an MP, and a lot of the residents that I talked to had moved out of areas like Barking and Dagenham, particularly in the 2000s, where they basically felt they'd lost their community, where social housing especially had predominantly gone to people who were not from Britain and who they complained, didn't look after the area, didn't look after the housing, and therefore kind of participated in this white flight, let's say, moving out. The reality is, what's happened in the East End has been a long time coming. I remember looking at that area in the 2000s, where you had really the first indication that things were not going to plan. The rise of the BNP in sort of 2004, 2005, the British National Party. I mean, that was, in my mind, a pretty explicitly far-right political party. And it was doing very well in areas like Barking and Dagenham, which were experiencing the most rapid population change of any area in the country. And so you began to get a sense that something wasn't quite right, as early really as the 2000s. And that then accelerated into lots of other areas around the East End and outer East London as these areas began to experience widespread change. And so, many people I think have felt, I'm not personally, I'm not one for, the idea that this is a kind of coordinated conspiracy, led by a small group of elites or leftists in alliance with, representatives of minority communities. But what I would say is it's a product of general incompetence, and it's a product of an elite class that holds a fundamentally different set of values from everybody else. And essentially what's happened is, mass migration has been imposed on those communities from above with no real discussion about how that would impact, resources, how it would impact feelings of belonging, and people were just left to navigate it on their own. One of my favorite books is by a French geographer called Christophe Gouillet, Twilight of the Elites, who looking at France, makes the point that if you look at the outer areas of big cities, a bit like the East End, what basically has happened is the elites kind of imposed, hyper globalization on those communities. They brought in large scale multinationals that had no real sense of national loyalty or obligation. They brought in mass immigration. They brought in like rapid demographic social change. They brought in a kind of low skill, low wage Deliveroo economy where everybody was fighting over these, crappy jobs that didn't pay very well, didn't give them much protection. There was no compensation for what had been lost through globalization. This is why I personally struggle with some of the decisions that Thatcher made in northern England and the industrial heartlands. I'm not by any means a Thatcherite economically. I think lots of those decisions, really did have a negative impact on lots of communities that later found its expression through things like Brexit, the fall of the Red Wall, the rise of Nigel Farage. Globalization basically hammered white working class communities in Western economies. I mean, we know that. We've got lots of evidence for that. And in the outer periphery areas of big cities like the East End, those effects were often felt most dramatically, and nobody bothered really to think about what might happen to people who had to live with those changes. And so unsurprisingly, they left. And I think one of the big stories in the UK that we don't talk about so much is just how many people from, the white British majority have left their communities and moved elsewhere. In some cases, actually, have moved out of the country altogether. I mean, this idea of the Great Retreat, people just leaving the UK more generally. And we don't really talk about that. It's very uncomfortable to talk about people moving out of communities. But with the East End, that's exactly what happened.
What do you make of the media's response to the anti-protests, the counter-protests the other night? There was meant to be 100 so-called far-right rallies across the country. Where that number came from, I think, is quite duplicitous or quite sort of suspicious. And then in response, you had these huge protests in areas of London that are extremely left-wing, where you see protests all the time about any number of issues. And you kind of saw a mixture of people, refugees welcome people, far left people, Islamist people come together. And then every single newspaper front page, whether it was the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, the Guardian, or the Times, had almost the exact same headline using the same photo, essentially the day when marchers destroyed the hateful people, the far right was destroyed by these communities supposedly coming together. What do you make of that media kind of reaction to these counter-protests?
Well, the first thing to say is, I think like everybody in the country, we all want the riots to stop. We don't want disorder, we don't want violence. So any decline in that, I think, is positive. Now, peaceful protests, I fully support, and if people want to peacefully protest, I think that's fine. I say that because I think much of the coverage in response to the riots and the disorder in recent days has been very curious. I found it, like lots of people, rather bizarre that the front page of every national newspaper basically had the same picture with the same message, which is essentially anti-racist triumph over far-right thugs, cementing this sort of, I guess, idea or narrative that the good guys have won and the bad guys have lost. And I think that's problematic for a number of reasons. One is, I think a lot of people who would have looked at newsstands would have realized that there was something very suspicious going on, and would have been asking themselves what was behind the sort of coordination of it. I think secondly, it reflected the panic and the anxiety and the concern among much of the elite class who clearly didn't quite understand what was happening in the country and why it was happening. So we're trying to kind of impose a kind of particular view that is sort of, the myth of Cable Street, almost going back to the interwar years, that, the good guys stood down the bad guys. We've had no real discussion about what led the bad guys onto the streets to begin with. We've had no real reckoning with that. This has been framed very much as a law and order criminality issue. Yvette Cooper, the Labour Home Secretary, has kind of come down hard on everybody involved with the protest, but we haven't had any meaningful discussion about what's behind them. And meanwhile, we've moved very quickly into what I think is a very worrying turn in British politics. Talking about clamping down on what people are tweeting, what they're saying on social media, expanding the definitions of Islamophobia, far right, and hate to basically stigmatize and silence people who maybe are critical of, Islam, or maybe have a slightly different view of migration. We've had, terms like far right being applied casually by the same people who weren't sure whether we should be referring to Hamas as terrorists. And I think you kind of have a perceived imbalance in how people have been having this conversation nationally. So I don't think people are idiots. I think people see that there's a broader competition or conflict playing out between the official narrative, which is what you saw on the front pages of those newspapers, and then the kind of unofficial narrative that we see on new media, on Twitter, X, YouTube, Substacks. And I think what was interesting about the riots and the unrest too, while we're having this conversation, is that, for the first time ever, unlike 2011, people could really get a sense of what was happening on the ground while looking at the BBC homepage and The Guardian and others, and realizing that they were being given a very particular narrative that was not reflective of what was actually happening on the ground. So I wrote about this week. I think the game has changed. I think there is a new media ecosystem, including, by the way, GB News. I think, it also includes YouTube, includes the Substacks, it includes Twitter X. And as Konstantin Kisin said this week on Twitter and X, there's no going back to where we were before. The conversation has been forced open. And watching also the likes of prominent left-wing commentators, Paul Mason, Jessica Seymour, Oliver Cam at the Times, even conservatives like Tim Montgomery, calling for alternative views to be shut down, television channels to be closed, licenses that have been given to alternative media to be revoked, Substackers to be chucked out of public life. Demonstrates the illiberalism that I think accompanies today's elite, that there is no serious interest in actually looking at the root cause of this. It is simply a kind of very childlike reaction of just get this out of the room. I don't want it. I've got my fingers in the ears. Everyone over here is a far-right thug. This is a criminality issue. Just get it out of the room. And if we need to kind of paint this narrative to convince you as to what's happened, we're going to do that. But actually what's left are the millions of people who are saying, well, hang on a minute, who's going to fix the borders? Who's going to lower migration? Who's going to integrate our local communities? Who's going to make us feel safe? And I think that is going to linger for many, many months and years after these events.
And just briefly, on this issue of, I don't know if you saw, but this chap who was arrested and charged and sentenced for 26 months for shouting and sort of gesturing at police officers during one of these protests. Do you think that if this guy was a black guy or an ethnic minority or a Muslim who did this exact same thing at, let's say, a pro-Gaza demonstration, would he have been sentenced to prison for more than 2 years?
I don't know, but I doubt it. And I think we've had a number of cases in recent years that have been deeply shocking for a lot of people. We've had a guy just recently who killed a child who was let out early after only a few years. We had the shocking case of Abdul Azidi, the asylum seeker, entered Britain illegally, applied for asylum once, didn't get it, applied for it again, didn't get it, sexually assaulted a woman, then decided he was going to change or convert to Christianity, applied for asylum and got it. And then he proceeded to pour acid over a mother and 2 children. These decisions should not be taking place in modern day Britain. We even had a case recently of an asylum seeker who assaulted a police officer and was then had no custodial sentencing at all because he couldn't speak English. So they just couldn't figure out what to do with him. And, this is what I mean about the underlying issue around making people feel safe and also loss of the familiar, the decline of law and order, the decline of security. and the decline of a sense of social cohesion and familiarity. And that is ultimately what is behind the riots and the protests. So we can have these kind of bizarre conversations about, well, this is the day that anti-racists won, but I don't think that's going to be very convincing at all. Much like in America, I don't think many people would argue the response to Trump has been very effective. If anything, he's as strong as ever. Unless you get into those underlying grievances, you're not really going to deal with the issue. And for Labour, that means doing something they're simply not going to tolerate, which is ending the policy of mass immigration. We need to end that policy if we're going to have a successful, integrated, healthy society. It's going to take a long, long time to get back to that, even after we've ended the policy. But we first need to acknowledge that this isn't working. The status quo is not working.
Matt Goodwin, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.